Back in the 1990s, TSR created campaign settings that let you play historical Vikings, ancient Romans, even Crusaders, using actual D&D rules. These weren't third-party books. They were official advanced D&D second edition releases, with new classes, rules, monsters, and magic to match each era. But many people today don't even know that these books existed. I'm going to dive into the historical reference series, 7 books that pushed D&D in a direction it never fully explored again, today on Daddy Rolled a 1. Hello there, and welcome back. I'm Martin. This is another video in my series on the history of early tabletop role-playing games, including Dungeons & Dragons. So this is where I talk about sort of those hidden corners of D&D history, the forgotten rules, the lost classes, and kind of the weird product lines like these green books. These are part of a series that is colloquially known as the Leatherette series. There were 3 of them, each with a different color. Obviously, these are the green ones. And the green stands for historical reference. And these were published between 1991 and 1994. There are 7 books total in the series. It was planned to go longer, but the series was abruptly canceled. Oh, maybe not abruptly, but it was canceled for a few reasons. We're going to talk about that when we get to discussing the last book in the series, which is the Crusades. So that'll be at the end, toward the end of the video. And these were sort of like mini campaign settings in a way. They were exactly what it says on the cover. They are historical reference guides for playing in different periods of Earth history. So in the video, I'm going to talk about what was happening at TSR at the time that caused these books to even be published in the first place, what made people think of it, and where did we get to the point where we're going to publish these particular products. And then I'm going to talk about some kind of commonalities that we're going to find among all of this series. Again, there's 7 books in total. And so we'll talk about like sort of what are the things that are in common with these. And you would think it would be a lot other than the material in terms of like the setting, but these are presented in a very, very different way. And I'm going to talk about that as well. Each one of these has a different writer, and so it's going to affect how the material is presented. I'm going to talk about what makes them unique in TSR's line of products, the creators and the artists that, I always try to talk about those when I can. And then I'll go through each book in publication order. So what's included in each, and then go over that kind of fun content that you can grab from these and use in any game that you're playing, regardless of the edition or the system. So I'm going to be going through these very quickly in order, probably about 10 minutes per video. It might be a little bit longer, shorter, depending. So I'm not going to be able to get into full depth, but I'm going to try to give you a sort of a snapshot of what's in these books to see if it's something that you might want to try to seek out. So because I only own 3 of them in physical format, I'm going to be going back and forth between my laptop and my desk here to show off my physical books. But again, because I wanted to keep it in physical order. So if you're like someone who's just curious, maybe you're a curious collector, you're interested in old school topics and these kind of hidden gems that show off TSR's design muscle at the time. And I'm going to get into that and why these were so unique. You might be really interested in these now. The unfortunate thing is if you are looking to collect old school products, these are some of the more expensive things that you're going to find in terms of, if you can find them at all. So just looking on eBay, most of these are going in the $100 to $200 range. It's because the sales on these weren't as high as some other books. A lot of people, just didn't get rid of them or didn't want to. And there are just not as many of them out there. So it's going to be difficult to collect, but you can find PDFs very easily. If you're an old school enthusiast, these are going to feel like that bridge between, they're going to connect us to that history of wargaming and role-playing. And we're going to talk about that in a second, what I mean by that. But this is a great way to kind of discover what the thinking was at TSR at the time as it relates to old school role-playing games. And then maybe you're coming from 5e, right? You're a refugee, I'll call it, from 5e. And you might be surprised just how bold the creators at D&D used to be in terms of doing totally different stuff like this, completely different magic systems, cultures, and rule sets for each one of these books to distinguish them from other things that they were publishing at the time. And a lot of people, I think, probably don't realize how innovative that was. So if you like rich lore and historical flavor, that kind of stuff, these books can still give you gameable ideas today, again, regardless of the system or edition of the game that you're playing. Now, if you enjoyed these kinds of looks into this forgotten history of Dungeons and Dragons, and if also you enjoy reviews of independent tabletop role-playing games, and DM advice, then please take a few seconds to like the video, make sure that you're double checked to subscribe to the channel, and that you're going to adjust the settings on that bell icon so you'll be notified when I upload new videos like this one. So I talked about this Leatherette series, and let's talk about what that means. So in 1989, TSR published the second edition of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, okay? And right away, pretty much right after this, they published this book, The Complete Fighter's Handbook. So, and you can see here, it's very plain. Just this plain writing here and this kind of like goldish, you can say it kind of reflecting through the window here if you're watching the video instead of just listening. But the cover is just plain brown. It just has the AD&D second edition logo. It has the TSR logo, and then it has the Complete Fighter's Handbook type, and then that's it. You know, the product number PHBR1, Player's Handbook, Rules Supplement 1, and then it has the product number 2110. So they published this book, and this was a big departure for them. People weren't publishing books specific to different character classes and different character races at the time. And TSR starts to do this. Nowadays, this is like, you know, just a common thing. They're called splat books, even. It's become so common, especially during the third edition era. But in second edition and before that, you didn't have dedicated guides from TSR for specific character classes. So this was a big change for them. But the other thing you'll notice is if you look at the Player's Handbook, look at this gorgeous full color painting here by Jeff Easley, iconic image for second edition. And then this has nothing. Okay. Just brown. It's also soft cover. So there's no, it's not hardcover. Now, why is that important? Because this is way cheaper to produce. First, they don't have to pay an artist for the cover art, which is very expensive. Okay. So they're not paying an artist, and because it's soft cover, it's very much cheaper to produce, and it has a higher margins than a hardcover book. So just for point of context, the Player's Handbook, published in 1989, is 256 pages, hardcover, and it's sold for $20. This book is 124 pages. This is the Complete Fighter's Handbook, soft cover, and it's sold for $15. Only $5 less than this Player's Handbook. So the margins on this were much better. Well, the Player's Handbook series, the Complete Handbook series, they're going to do one for every class and every race in the Player's Handbook, except they're going to combine gnomes and halflings into one book, but otherwise every class and race gets its own book. And then they're going to add new ones like psionics and barbarians and ninja, and they're going to add a book on playing humanoid characters like orcs, goblins, lizardmen, what have you. All that series is going to sell. There's going to be 15 books total in this particular series. I have a whole video that talks about all 15 of the books in that series, so I'll link to that up here if you want to learn more. But the point that I'm talking about this is that these books sold really, really well. They sold very well, and they were very cheap to produce. And so, of course, TSR is like, well, let's do more of those. And so they immediately go with the idea, just a year later, or a year or two, with publishing the GR series, Dungeon Master's Guide Reference Supplement. Those are known as the blue books. So very similar format. It's just type on a blue background instead of being a brown background. But again, this background, it's kind of hard to see. It's thick, but that's why it's called Leatherette. It's made to kind of look like it's a leather book. Okay. So then you have the blue ones that look like, I guess, blue leather, which to me doesn't make as much sense. But the Dungeon Master's Rules Guides, the DMGR series, those are things that are going to help a DM world build or build dungeons, create dungeons. They also have books on like naval adventures, ships in the sea. They have books for, there's a book on hiring specialist characters as NPCs, like, masons or smiths or scribes or cartographers. And then there's one on even making like necromancer adversaries, the complete book of necromancers for your player characters. That book, I have done a full video on just that particular book, Necromancers. And so you want to check that out if you want to learn more about that one. Well, those also sell well. Okay. So then TSR naturally thinks we need a third book in this series of books. We need more. What are we going to do next? And so a few things are going on at the company that lead us to these historical guides and why this was picked. One is that a few years before, James Ward, who was working at the company at the time, he was one of the early employees of TSR in the 70s, but he's still with the company in the early 90s. But he had been working with Rose Estes, another employee of TSR, on creating an education department for TSR with the idea of producing originally a set of World War II war games that would be part game and entertainment, but also include history and teach history to kids. And this idea of of publishing something like that was very interesting to them. Now, the other reason that James wanted to push this idea, if you remember, I have a whole video on the Satanic Panic that was happening at the time. So check that out if you're not aware of that or you haven't heard of that before. But there was a group of people coming after D&D, just like groups of people came after comic books and rock and roll music, and that come after video games and rap music and whatever it is, that blamed D&D for all the faults of their kids, kids getting into trouble and stuff. And so James didn't want to deal with that and wanted to fight back. And so he wrote some articles in Dragon Magazine, and I talk about them in that video, where he basically says they created second edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and then that's why they took out demons and devils and assassins and half-orcs, because they didn't want to get angry letters from moms complaining that D&D was too violent or it was a cult or whatever it was. And so the idea then that you would have a series of supplements that are teaching history, no one's going to argue with teaching history, or at least they shouldn't argue with teaching history. And so James was very much a proponent of like this educational aspect of these war games. Now, the other thing that's going to happen during this time is that you've got a couple of people not just a couple, you have employees at TSR in the 90s, some of whom were hired, again, all the way back in the 70s, like James Ward. Well, they discovered D&D through a history of actually playing miniatures war games. You have to remember the creators of the game, even Dave Arneson, Gary Gygax, and the other people that they were around, they were playing miniatures war games, usually with a historical bent, almost exclusively with an historical bent, whether it was Napoleonic or ancients like Greeks and Romans, or whether it was Civil War or the Middle Ages or World War II or World War I, whatever it was. They were used to playing these history war games, and a lot of them were still at TSR at the time. And this natural connection between the history of war games and Dungeons and Dragons to them seemed like a natural fit. And so two of them specifically are going to be Dave Cook and Steve Winter. And they are going to champion this idea of creating a series of historical supplements for Advanced D&D Second Edition to become the third part of this Leatherette line. And part of the reason that they wanted to do it, Steve Winters later on, he's interviewed and he talks about the idea. It's like, well, we wanted to create it because we loved history. We thought it was a natural fit, but also they wanted to write some of the books. And so they championed this line so that they could be two authors. And so Dave and Steve are going to write 2 of the 7 books in this series. So this is a very specific case of like the idea of like, you can create something. And so we're going to create it and then figure out how to sell it. So it's the marketing versus engineering thing of business. There's a whole discussion of that. But this is not a case where it seems like marketing figured out that people wanted this and then asked people to write it. It seems like a case where the writers came up with an idea that they wanted to do and then said, well, you guys should sell this. Okay. So that was part of the reason why these got made. Now, I talked about earlier that each one of these 7 books is going to have a completely different author, and that's going to affect the presentation, the writing style, but like even what kind of content is included and the order in which it's included. And we're going to see that as we go through these. I'm going to point it out pretty specifically that the order is almost never consistent in terms of what's presented, what kinds of content is presented, which books use character kits from the complete handbook series, which ones don't. It's never consistent. And I think that does affect the usefulness of some of these books because you don't always know where to look for what it is that you're trying to get. So usually they're going to say that you can use these books in 3 ways. You can play a strictly historical game where it's just Earth history and there's no magic and monsters. You can play a sort of quote legendary game, which is a combination of like history with a little bit of magic, or you can play a fantasy game that has some historical trappings to it. So those are going to be the 3 ways, but not every book is presented that way. Some of the books just say this is historical fantasy, and if you want to adjust it up or down, you figure out how to do that. So that again is not consistent with the presentation here. And then the other thing that I think these books kind of struggle with a little bit is I think a lot of them lean very much into, we have to present a historical overview of what life was like living during this time period. And they don't lean heavy enough into, here's the fun gameable stuff that you want from these things, the monsters, the treasures, the character archetypes, that kind of stuff. Or like adventure hooks. Here's a standard adventure for these particular types of settings and cultures. And instead, sometimes it does become a very dry overview of here's the law and customs of this particular time period and whatnot. And it's not fun to read. And it's also not easy to understand how you can use that in a particular game. I approach these books the way I think a lot of people did, which is that, I wanted to figure out how to use firearms and advanced timeline, it's science and things like that from the 1550s to 1650s, which is what the Mighty Fortress covers. I wanted to use that in a D&D game. I didn't want to play in, that era of Earth history. Like, that wasn't of interest to me, but modeling certain parts of my campaign world on those time periods and cultures was of interest to me. And I wanted to figure out how to do that. And unfortunately, these books don't really help you with doing that, even though they say that they're going to. And, I don't think that was necessarily a design goal. So that's probably more on me, of my expectations of what I wanted out of these books versus how they're written. But looking back on them now, I do think that they do become a little bit, they read like textbooks in a lot of cases. And I think that that's a fault of the series, but, I should say it's not a fault. It's a missed opportunity, I guess I should say. The Vikings one, I think, is probably the least egregious example of that. And it's interesting that was written by Dave Cook. And I talk about that when I get to that particular book. But I do think that these books represent a very interesting point in time of TSR experimenting very hard with tone and genre before settings like Planescape or Spelljammer or things like that, where they really go heavy into like weird and experimental settings. These are a time period where they're starting to understand that they can adjust the rules and the mechanics of the game to evoke the setting. And that was not something that TSR was used to doing. Some of these books were written to be pairs. So the Celts and Romans books were written to be pairs, and the first two books, the Vikings and Charlemagne's Paladins, were written to be paired up together. Some of the books were written kind of independently, which is the Mighty Fortress, but then some of the books were written to be paired, but the pair was never written. And so you'll want to stay tuned to watch and figure out what we could have gotten had the line continued. And you'll see that kind of toward the end of the video. All right, so that's going to be the quick background, hopefully quick background on this, and we're going to launch into the video proper now. And stay tuned for HR1 Vikings. If you are looking for ways to support the Daddy Roll the One channel, there are 3 ways you can do so right now. You can become a super fan, and you'll get your name added to this list of other folks who contributed to the channel by hitting that little heart icon with the $sign in it. It really super helps me out, folks, with upgrading my equipment, which I've been doing over the past year. You've heard me talk about that before. And I really appreciate the folks who were able to do that, to thank me for all the time and effort that goes into creating these videos, research, and recording and editing the videos. You can also buy something from my shop. You can buy a t-shirt, hoodie, mug, or tote bag from my spread shop. And if you're into paper goods, you can buy a sticker, poster, or notebook. And the notebook can be either spiral or hardbound with blank pages, lined paper, or graph paper. If you want to use the graph paper to draw a dungeon, you can do so. And all with designs that are exclusive to my shop and that I created specifically for fans of tabletop role-playing games, especially old school games. And then the third way is that you can buy my supplement seen here. This is Alchemy, Explosives, and Inventions. I wrote this for old school D&D games like BX D&D, or for Old School Essentials very specifically, which is a retro clone of BX D&D. But you can use it with any class and level system and adventure game. Even 5th edition, there's ideas that you can use in here. But this is a book about playing expert level characters. It's got 15 different backgrounds with little tweaks to the standard classes. It's got dozens and dozens of random tables that you can use. It has 3 new classes: Alchemists, Demolitionists, and Inventors. It has tons of pages of new equipment. It has a guild hall, a 3-story guild hall with NPCs, rumors, secrets, adventure hooks, and things like that. It has advice on running expert level campaigns. All of that in this book. It's available as a POD print-on-demand book, soft cover, or as a PDF at DriveThruRPG, and you can get it in your choice of this paper, parchment style background paper, or if it's easier on the eyes, you can get plain white paper. So you can find that on DriveThruRPG, and thank you so much for your support. So let's take a look at HR1 Vikings Campaign Sourcebook from the Historical Reference Series. And so you see here, unlike the brown complete handbooks that were really just the title and the logos, the green source books all have sort of like a little diagram or an icon or something like that on the front cover. So this particular one has a Viking longship that you see here at the bottom. But again, very graphic style. It's not a realistic style at all. And you see the logo here that TSR was using at the time. We're also going to see that logo change over time as we go through these historical reference guides, which is kind of fun. All right, so this is written by Dave Zeb Cook. We talked about Dave before, probably best known for having been the main designer behind Advanced Dungeons and Dragons second edition, also wrote the 1985 Oriental Adventures for first edition AD&D. And I do think that that was a crucial thing for him to have written, to be, one of the lead designers on this line and write the first book, because he had a history of taking historical elements from Earth history and culture and adapting them to gameable content. So, he's only going to work on this particular book, but I have a feeling that he and Steve Winter might have kind of worked together to kind of have a consistent look to some of these books, or consistent content. Also is the cook of the Moldvay Cook Marsh edition of BX D&D, the one that I run for my daughter and her friends. So he worked with Steve Marsh on the expert set of that particular line of books. Okay, so all the way back to 1981. So he'd been around the company for a while. Now, the art in this particular one is going to be by Ned Dameron, and Ned is someone who, he's still with us, and his mom was an artist. He ended up becoming an artist, has a very specific style that kind of romanticizes architecture and that kind of thing. And so he did a lot of book covers, so things like the Dark Tower series for Stephen King. He also did a series called the covers for the second generation books by Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman of Dragonlance fame. And he worked at TSR for over a decade after he left a career in advertising at an ad agency, which I felt a kinship for, because most of if you watch the channel, I do own a boutique ad agency here in the Pasadena area of Los Angeles. Worked a lot on the Forgotten Realms. He worked on Ravenloft and a lot more while he was at TSR. And again, like I said, he is still with us, which is great. Now, the editing on this one is done by Newton Ewell, which I think is interesting because he's mostly known as being an artist. But he did do some editing when he worked with TSR. But he did a lot of artwork for like Realm Space, Kryn Space, things like that. And but again, he was also an editor on a few different products. And so let's jump in and look at the introduction here. So Dave Cook starts us out by telling us what people get wrong about Vikings. I think most people would know this by now, but back then, we've got to remember, this is 1990, 92? Might be late 91. 91, I guess it says. This was, people didn't necessarily know. So he says most people think of Vikings, what they know of them come from comic strips like Hagar the Horrible, which I remember reading as a kid in the newspaper, but also Prince Valiant, or the Bugs Bunny cartoon, like the classic opera cartoon. And which I love. And so he says, well, those are incorrect. So he says, like, Vikings loot and pillage. He says, not all people did that. Viking was a specific term used for a specific person who did go raiding. But in this case, they're going to use Viking as a generic term to describe anybody from Scandinavia. He says all Vikings are bloodthirsty pagans, and he says no. And in fact, at a certain point in time during the end of the Viking era, a lot of Vikings had converted to Christianity. And then it says Vikings are all ignorant savages. And he says, well, no. And he talks about that. And then he says Vikings never did wear horned helmets. So he says, sorry, that wasn't a thing. And then he talks about how you're going to use this book to play a campaign. And it says it's more than just a setting for Vikings in a fantasy campaign. It is a passport into the real world of the Vikings. You're going to see that phrase come up in one of the future books, and we'll talk about that later. And then he says historical fantasy venturing is just that. It's an opportunity for campaigns and adventurers to role play in the real worlds and lands of history, but they're going to use fantasy trappings. So unlike later books that are going to divide it up and tell you how you can do a strictly historical campaign, or you can do a high fantasy campaign, or a blend of the two. In this particular case, he's going to say, no, it's going to be presented as historical fantasy, and that's how the book's written. And then if you want to adjust it, that's on you, which is, that's fine. And then he says that finally the Viking sourcebook can be used to recreate a Viking setting in other campaign worlds. Details on placing and adapting Viking culture and beliefs to the Forgotten Realms, Greyhawk, and Dragonlance campaigns is given. Instructions on adapting the Viking sourcebook to the DM's personal campaign is also provided. This is where I think this book kind of falls down, and in fact, all of them do. So they tell you that they're going to tell you how to use this book in other campaign settings. They really don't. It's presented, or at least if it's in here, it's kind of buried, and it's not written the kind of way which I think the book should have been. I think it should have been, here's how to make a Viking type culture in your campaign, but instead it's presented as kind of almost like a dry history book in some cases. So he talks about how to get started, and then it's going to present this timeline, this horizontal bar that goes across. And I like this. I like the presentation of the horizontal bar to see the time listed, and just having graphics to break up the text is very helpful because this is a very text heavy book. So it's going to talk about some suggested reading if you want to learn more. And then it's going to launch into characters and combat, races in a Viking campaign. It's going to tell you that while there were dwarves and elves in Viking campaign, they were like mystical, mysterious creatures that you didn't want to interact with. And so you're not going to play a dwarf or an elf. You're going to play a human. And maybe you can play a trollborn, which is a human with troll blood. But for the most part, you're going to be human. And then in order to differentiate your humans, because you don't have all these different races like you're used to having, dwarves, elves, halflings, half-orcs, what have you, you're going to have character gifts. And you're going to roll on this table, and this is going to give you something like you have bad luck or good luck or a blood feud or your family's outlawed or you're ugly or you're courageous, etc. So I like this, and it's something that you could use in any game. We are going to see it come up in a few of the other supplements, but not every supplement, and I think that's a missed opportunity. I think they should have been in every supplement and written these gifts to kind of correspond to evoke the culture that they were trying to. I will stop really quick to point out, I know I'm probably talking faster than you're normally used to, and I'm going very, very quickly. And that's just because there's so much material to cover. So this is actually the second time I've covered this particular book, because the first time it took 20 minutes, and that's too long with everything that I have to talk about. All right, so I'm going to go back into, it's going to talk about the character gifts here, and then it's going to get into the Trollborn and basically say, if you want to play a Trollborn, what you get is you get to add +1 to your strength, constitution, and intelligence, but you have to suffer -1 to wisdom and -2 to charisma. You can be fighter, ranger, berserker, runecaster, or sorcerers. So berserkers and runecasters are introduced in this book. Sorcerer was not a class at this point in time, and I'm not sure why they use the word sorcerer, because they don't really describe that in this particular book. I think that was just kind of a miss, although I could be missing something. But in any event, it says how you can play that Trollborn character. And then for warriors, the main change you're going to make to fighters is changing the followers that they get. So not that big of a change. Fighters, when they reached a certain level in these versions of D&D, you automatically attracted followers because you built a stronghold. And so this is going to tell you what your followers are going to be like. Okay, and then it's going to introduce 2 new classes, berserkers and runecasters, both of which are in the warrior group. So the berserkers one makes sense, and it presages a lot of the things that we're going to associate with barbarians in 3rd edition. It's very different from the barbarian from 1st edition D&D in the Unearthed Arcana book. But this is where you get the idea of that rage, right? That adds to your strength and your attack ability and all that kind of stuff. But it also is going to improve your armor class, and it's going to give you bonus hit points, and it's going to make it harder for people to charm you. But when your rage wears off, your berserker rage wears off, then you're exhausted. That's very similar to the way that barbarians operate in 3rd edition. And this is before that, but we're starting to see some of these changes that might show up in 3rd edition. Okay, so that's the berserker class. They also can shape change. So into a wolf at 4th level, a cave bear at 7th level, and then they have this ability called Shape Journey, which is seen through the eyes of other animals. So you send your spirit out into the world in the form of an animal, which is typically a raven, wolf, bear, or bull. So if you're familiar with the character Bran from Game of Thrones or the Song of Ice and Fire series, however you want to refer to that, that's coming from this tradition of the Shape Journey. Okay, so it talks all about doing that. Very flavorful class. Then you have the Runecasters, which is essentially the spellcasting class of this system, but they put them as warriors. I think it would have made more sense to make them priests, but they didn't. So it says they possess the knowledge of runes, magical words that when used properly generate or release special powers. And then it says if you are going to play a wizard, you have to be a specialist wizard, and the only one you can be is a conjurer, diviner, enchanter, illusionist, or necromancer. And then it says priests don't work because the abilities that are described in a D&D as a D&D priest don't translate to the kinds of things that we see in the myths and legends or the history of the Norse people. So you can't play a priest class. And then for rogues, it says that they're not going to be good at removing traps, finding and removing traps, and opening locks, because those things weren't really developed to that level in Viking society. And so in place of that, they're going to be able to open barred doors. That's the replacement for that. And then it says bards are known as skalds, and they operate basically like a standard bard. But it says that they use very specific poetic descriptions. They're called kennings. And so they give you this whole list here, which I think is really fun. So arrows are wounded bees, or poetry is giant's drink or meat of Odin, or Odin's theft. And the sea is the belt of the earth, or the plain of seals, that kind of thing. They use this very colorful descriptive language. And that's a way that you can help evoke a Viking type setting by using some of these phrases, and they give you a whole list here. It's going to talk about how the first impression most players will have concerning Viking characters is that it is a world of men. So it's very male dominated. And so it's going to have this whole section here on how you can play a female character and how to do that. I think it would just be fine to say it's a game, play a female character and move on. Unless you're playing a strictly historical game, there's no reason not to. And if you've seen the TV show Vikings, which is a great show, by the way, women characters feature in that a lot. Okay. And then it has this whole section on names. And again, this is where I think it's very common in the second edition era for things to be overwritten, explain more than you need to explain. All it needed to say is that names are important, and here's a list of names that you can choose from. But instead, we get almost a whole page on how to pick a name. But they do give you these different Viking names, which are very, very flavorful. I do wish that they used a way to pronounce some of these names, because it's not always obvious how to pronounce them. The Celts book that you're going to see later does do that, and that was the thing I appreciated from that particular book. But they have men's names, women's names, and then nicknames. The nicknames are fun. So like so-and-so the Stout, or the Unruly, or, the Serpent Tongue, that kind of thing. I think that's cool. I like that. It's talking about non-weapon proficiencies that aren't applicable to this setting, like heraldry, airborne writing, spellcraft, forgery, charioteering. Gives a list of languages, and then it gets into these runes, which again is like the magic. So these are things like Beast Rune that allows you to understand the speech of a particular animal, or an Ale Rune that helps detect the presence of poison and protects others against poisoning. There's Catch Runes, Charm Runes, Dead Runes, Disease Runes, Lore Runes, the Iron Can't Bite Rune. These are really fun. They're very evocative of the setting. And again, this is where you're changing the rules of D&D to evoke the setting. And that's something that this book, I think, does better than most of the books in the historical reference series. Okay, and then it tells you how to create other runes if you want to. It talks about second sight, which gives people to see things beyond the ken of normal folk. And then it goes all through that and how to do it. The role of monsters, the existing monsters, which are pretty much all animals that you would have found in the monster manual. It tells you that those make sense, but it also goes into things like specters, zombies, werewolves, and it gives you all like the Norse or Viking name for those. But merman, dragon, nixies, goblins, brownies, revenants, all that kind of stuff. Poltergeist, nymphs, ghosts. I like that kind of stuff. And then it adds new monsters. It talks about the role of dwarves and elves, giants, which is a big part of Norse culture, trolls. Again, we've seen that that's a big part. And then it gets into money and how it worked, the weights and coins and the different names of them, the available types of equipment, and then new equipment descriptions like bearing dials and combs, which were used as treasure, wagons, longships, sleighs. It gets into a little bit of magical items and existing items, and it gives you a list of unavailable magic items that you wouldn't use in a campaign like this. And then a roll of new magical items, Viking magical items, Mirror of Transformation, Bottomless Drinking Horn, very fun stuff there. Viking swords it gets into. And then it's going to describe Viking culture, and it's going to give us like this year in a life of this character that they're going to call Ivar. And it's going to give you like nonfiction details, and then it's going to give you like a story. So, and it's going to go through like by quarter, spring, summer, winter, and fall, and what was happening during those different time periods. And that's how they're going to describe the day in the life. And it's going to get into social rankings, freemen, nobles, thralls, kings, the warrior's way. There's maps here. This is a fortress in Denmark. Viking women, female adventures. We'd already talked about that, but we're going to talk about it again here. Maps for a farmhouse and for a barracks, houses and farms, food and drink, trade, law. This is the stuff that starts to get a little bit dry, because a lot of it just tells you details from a historical standpoint, but it doesn't tell you how to use this in a game to make your game more fun. So there's stuff in here about law. It's pretty long, but how relevant is this to the game that I'm playing? And it doesn't give you ideas of like this, Vikings did this. They had these kind of laws. This is how it might come up in a game. And then here's an adventure hook. An adventure hook with this kind of stuff would be super helpful. Talks about religion, which I think would have been very important, but it's very skimmed over. So very, very light on the religion. Then it goes into a gazetteer of the world, talks about all the different areas. And I love this particular part, the imaginary lands. So Alfheim, Asgard, Jotunheim, Mirkwood, Muspelheim, Nilfheim, all these kinds of stuff. I really like that. There's plans for deck plans for a longship. And then you have your map here at the end. This is a fold-out map that would have been in the book, all color. You'll see some of those in my books, except I never took them out of my books, and I still haven't, so I'm not able to unfold mine, but this is what the Vikings one looked like. And then here's the back cover. Vikings, campaign source book from the wrath of the Northmen. O Lord, deliver us. That's the quote that's in here. And then it says, now you can take your campaign and player characters into the realms of the Northmen. No mere fantasy world. It's set in the historical world of Viking legend, and included are new character classes, magic, spells, monsters, treasures, and necessary background information on the life and times of the Vikings. Floor plans, full color map to give you complete role-playing package. So that's the description on the back cover here. And that is our look at HR1 Vikings by Dave Cook from 1991. Okay, so continuing along with Charlemagne's Paladins, this is HR2. It's a historical reference, and you can see here that the image on the front is this crown in that kind of gold leaf format. I will look at the back cover first, and it says Charlemagne's Paladins campaign sourcebook. Lay on, soldiers of France, this day we win or die. That's the quote, and then it just gives you a little bit of info about what you can find in this particular book. Charlemagne, conqueror, statesman, lawmaker, the greatest medieval king of Europe. His reign lasted 44 years, but his influence was felt for 1,000, and then it goes on and on. Okay, so obviously if you're listening and not watching, I actually do have this one as a physical book that I'm showing here on the screen now. So it gets into the credits. So the editing was done by Mike Brolt, and we've talked about him before on the channel. And the illustrations here were done by Roger Ropp. Now, we haven't talked about Roger, so let's briefly go over him. Roger unfortunately died in 2019, the age of 56, which is really sad. Very young. But he played D&D in high school. And then he was doing art for a student magazine while he was in college. And it was printed at the same place where Dragon Magazine had a lot of their work printed as well. And Tim Kask ended up seeing some of Roger Ropp's work and approached him about doing some stuff for TSR. And so he ends up working on Dragon Magazine, doing art and cartography, and eventually coming over to the main TSR to do work. And eventually he's going to end up becoming the art director for all of TSR. So he does the art on this one. Now, the book itself is written by Ken Ralston. Ken is another person that we haven't really spent a lot of time talking about, but Ken does end up working. Well, he's still with us as well, and worked a lot in the role-playing game industry. He does a ton of work with Avalon Hill. He worked on the Gazetteer series for TSR, which is like the Beckman line for their campaign setting, but also Star Frontiers. He worked on C3, the module C3, the Lost Island of Castamere. He worked on RuneQuest for Avalon Hill, a ton of work for RuneQuest. And also the Paranoia role-playing game. I know this is popular with a lot of folks from back then. And he also worked with Games Workshop, so very, very prolific and in his role-playing game career. So let's look at just really quick the introduction to this book, the table of contents, that is. So there's going to be an introduction, a survey of Carolingian history, character design, setting, equipment and treasure, the tales of Charlemagne and his paladins, adventures on the Saxon frontier, and pre-designed player characters. So as you can see already, the order of presentation and what's going to be included in this book is already different than what we saw in Vikings. There's no standardization here. Some of the sections are the same, but they're not in the same order necessarily. So really, really briefly, it's going to go through again how to use this book. And this is where we get this kind of definition on you can play a historical campaign, a legendary campaign, which it says exploits the legends of Charlemagne and his paladins as recounted in the late medieval tales, but it's going to include some magic. So, and it talks about that here. And then it says, or you can play a fantasy campaign, which says it melds a weak magic AD&D fantasy campaign with various historical and legendary elements associated with Charlemagne and his time. So, and then it says this is not a history book. And then it gives you DM tips for it says your task is similar to that of a historical novelist, which is interesting. So, some nice art here by Roger Ropp. So then it's going to get into the timeline, okay, of the Carolingian Empire. And that's going to go on for quite a while. Now, they're not going to present it as a timeline format like we saw in the Vikings book. It's just presented as bullet points here, essentially, year by year. There is going to be some suggested reading. And then we're going to get into our character design. And it's going to tell us that for the warrior classes, now, one of the things that this book leans into that I wish the Vikings book did was that it's going to adopt this use of the character kits, which were part of the complete handbook series. And it's going to say, well, if you're using those, some of the warrior kits that you can use from the complete fighter's handbook would be the peasant hero, wilderness hero, or pirate outlaw. But then it's going to create a new kit, the noble Carolingian warrior, which is kind of their equivalent of a paladin in a way, without having the magical abilities. But it's going to tell you that you can play that as a sportsman or as a ambitious noble or a Christian soldier of the empire. And it's going to tell you what skills you should have, weapon proficiencies, non-weapon proficiencies, equipment, your special benefits that you get, which is just a reaction bonus from anyone from your own culture, hospitality of other nobles, churchmen, and monasteries when traveling. And then your hindrances, which that you're expected to honor your oaths and Christian virtues. And you may be bound by your king or count by personal oath, etc. So it gets into that. Then it's going to talk about fighters. And again, it's going to change the fighter follower table that you get at higher levels. It's going to get into Rangers a little bit, but it says they have no place in a historical or legendary Carolingian campaign. It's going to talk about Paladins and then the wizard classes, and it's going to tell you, again, you can play specialist wizards, but there's special restrictions. So if you do use them, you can only play a conjurer, diviner, enchanter, or illusionist. It's going to give you a whole section on prohibited spells, which again, I think was helpful. And then it's going to talk about the priest classes, and then it's going to get into permitted priest kits that you could be, which would be nobleman, priest, peasant, scholar, prophet. And then it's going to create a new kit, the Western Church. Clunky name for a kit. I don't know why, the Western Church is the name of the organization, but that's also the name of the kit. And it's going to describe how that would work in a game like this. And then it's going to get into the different spheres and spells that kit is allowed, the spells that are allowed, restrictions on spell effects, and then it's going to get into the rogue classes and tell you the permitted rogue kits. And it's going to say, well, the Noble's Clerk kit is kind of like the one that you should use. But the other rogue kits that you could be, this would be from the Complete Thieves Handbook, would be Scout, Spy. That's it. And then it's going to create this Noble's Clerk kit, which I like the idea of this, but it's not very adventure worthy, I don't think. And then it talks about like standard thieves and then bards. And it says like the magical and non-magical abilities of the bard have no place in a historical Carolingian campaign, just like we saw with some of these other classes. It's going to get into race, and it says they're all human. That's all you can play. A little bit more here on the sex of the character and the role of women adventures. A little bit on names, less than what we saw in the Vikings book. And then it talks about, different male and female names listed. And it says building a player character group. It's going to talk about proficiencies here, and then it's going to talk about healing, priest divination, consecrated areas. Okay, so this is all standard stuff here. Loss of powers, penance, trial by combat, all that's in the character section. Then you're going to get to the setting. So in the Vikings book, chapter 4 was all about magic. Well, they've kind of just talked about magic already in the character section. So then they're going to get into the setting and talk about all the different nations, the empire, the frontiers, foreign lands, wilderness and nature, rural manners, everyday life, travel, trade and manufacturing. Starts to get into some of that kind of like really dry stuff. There's a whole section on monasteries and a little map section. The king and the law, the palace school and the Carolingian resistance, social classes, peasants and slaves, very minimal art in here, very wall of text style of presentation, priests and monks, the art of war, faith and superstition, the Western Church, the clergy. Talks about the Teutonic pantheon because, again, they're trying to tie this to the Vikings book. Pagan myths, Carolingian encounters, and then it gives you all these like animals that you could encounter: dogs, wolves, whales and giant squids, horses, ponies, mules. Creatures of legend, and it talks a little bit about that: Hans and Huakava, lycanthropes. Okay, and then it gets into equipment and treasure, and again, it goes over money, magical items, holy relics, which is important to this, but it's very short. And then it gets into tales of Charlemagne and his Paladins. So this is not game stats. These are just lists of characters and stories from the myths of the Carolingian Empire, or the Carolingian time period, really. Okay, and then this is something that's brand new. We didn't see this in Vikings. These are adventures that you could have on the Anglo-Saxon or on the Saxon frontier. and it, like Brago and the Boar, and then it gives you a background, NPCs that you'd run into, Race to the Gate, the Winter Hunt, Chill of Warning Light, the Great Boar. It keeps going. This is all part of the same adventure. Okay. And then it gives you some maps here of different structures that you could have. Following the Dead End Troll, Invitation to the Christmas Eve Feast. So putting adventures in here, I think is kind of cool. So we, again, something that we didn't see in the Vikings book, but it's pretty long. There's a few different adventures in here that are presented. And then you get your appendix of your pre-designed player characters. Okay. Which include Brother Theory, the priest with the nobleman priest kit, Frida of I can't read that. Frida of Ardennes, noble Carolingian warrior. Louisa of Ardennes is a fighter. Lotho of Ardennes, another fighter. So see lots of fighters. Pinabel the Gascon is a rogue with the noble priest kit or the noble clerk kit. You have Alonso the Moor, fighter with the wilderness warrior kit. Essica the Saxon, fighter with the wilderness warrior kit. And Einar the Dane, a fighter with the wilderness warrior kit. Okay, and then you have a map here that folds out. I never took mine out of the book, so it's still glued in. So it's not going to open, unfortunately. But that's it. That's what we have here from Charlemagne's Paladins. Okay, and let's look now at HR3, Celts, Campaign Sourcebook, Historical Reference. And the cover here, there's this kind of just graphical design here. So I'm actually not quite sure what that is trying to depict. Part of the problem with these particular books when you're looking at them in PDF is that the gold print on the green, it shows up really well in person, but in a PDF, it doesn't always come through very, very well. So you can see here, like at the bottom, the TSR logo is very difficult to make out. All right, so let's look at this, starting with the author, Graeme Davis. So Graeme Davis is one of two kind of famous Graemes who worked also with Games Workshop. So it's Graeme, if you're listening and not watching, it's Graeme Davis. And he started playing D&D in the mid-1970s, like right after the game debuted. And he ends up writing for White Dwarf magazine, which was published by Games Workshop, and they had a deal with TSR at the time. And then later he's going to write for Imagine magazine, which was the by this point TSR and Games Workshop had ceased working together, and TSR had opened its own UK studio or UK, distribution area, and they created a magazine called Imagine, a lot of which was reprints of Dragon magazine articles, but they also had their own articles, and so Graeme's going to write for them as well. If you want to learn more about the history of TSR UK, see my video on the Fiend Folio and their work with Games Workshop, and I'll put a link to that up here. So he is going to end up being one of the main designers on Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. He writes for fighting fantasy books from Steve Jackson Games, and with Steve Jackson. And then he's going to write Vikings for GURPS. Okay, so kind of just all around known for kind of writing in this particular type of genre. He's also going to work on the Mythic Britain and Ireland supplement for the game. I'm not sure how to say this, so I've seen some people say Wiesen. I've seen some people say Vaesen and some people say Vossen or Vaesen, which I don't think is correct, but it's a newer game. It's Vaesen. So however you pronounce that, he wrote the Mythic Britain and Ireland book for that particular supplement. Our art here is going to be done by Roger Ropp. We have already talked about him just a second ago with the Charlemagne's Paladins. The editing is going to be done by Thomas Reed. And Thomas Reed basically was born in Colorado, but went to school in Texas and answered an ad after graduating from, I think it was Houston, University of Houston. He answered an ad in Dragon magazine for editors at TSR. He goes, gets the job. He works at TSR, moves to Wisconsin, and for about 6 years works there. And he's eventually going to be promoted from being an editor to the creative director at TSR. And then when Wizards of the Coast acquires TSR, he's going to move to Seattle and continued to work with them on stuff like, Ravenloft and Forgotten Realms. He worked on Dragon Mountain, the Star Wars role-playing game, the Wheel of Time role-playing game that TSR, or that Wizards of the Coast put out in the D20 era. And he's also a novelist and a short story writer. So that's Thomas Reed. And then Steve Sullivan, we've talked about here on the channel before with cartography. So let's just get into what's in this book. And you can see this one's actually going to be a lot closer to the structure of the Vikings book. So it's going to start out with who are the Celts, and get into that history, and then about this book. And then you can see this is right away. You can tell this is like the Vikings book. It says this source book is more than just a setting for Celts in a fantasy campaign. It is a passport into the real world of the Celts. That's almost word for word what we saw in the Viking books, obviously just replacing Vikings with Celts. So it talks about that and how you can use it to create your own Celtic inspired setting in your own campaign world that you're using, or in Forgotten Realms or Greyhawk or Dragonlance, etc. Again, I don't think it does a good job of doing that, but it says that you can do that. So it talks about how to get started, and then the second edition rules. This is all stuff that we saw in the Vikings book. Now, one thing that's really fun is they talk about like what's in a name, and it says the Romans called them the Gauls or the Galli. And then he says the Greeks called them Keltoi. And then it says there's still debate over whether you're supposed to say Celts or Celts. And because they said, like, you don't call them the Boston Celtics, you call them the Boston Celtics. However, the Greeks called them Keltoi with a K, but they also did have a letter, Greek letter C with a soft C sound. So why didn't they call them Celtoi? And it's because, they called them the Keltoi. And so they're going to assume that we should use a hard C and call them Celts. So this is the timeline. And again, presentation is very similar to what we saw with the Vikings book, this kind of timeline format, which again, I find much easier to look at and read than what we saw before in the Charlemagne's Paladins book. Some suggested reading again. It talks about names and of places to like historic names of places that you might want to use in a game like this. Then it gets into the characters and combat, and it talks about like most of your characters are going to be humans, but you might have a rare character that carries blood of Fomorians, which are giants, or She, which are like fey creatures. And then it has those character gifts where you're going to roll. And a lot of these are repeated from the Vikings book, but of course they're going to replace things like the rune casting things. Some of the stuff from the Vikings book are going to get replaced in here. But I like this, and I think it should have been part of all the books. Why not? Because you're trying to because most of your characters are going to be human, you don't have the other races to kind of make them different. So having those character gifts kind of gives that little differentiation. Okay, so they have like this thing called, I don't know how to pronounce it, Riastarte, but it's like warp frenzy. It's very much like a berserker rage, but that's a gift that you can have. And then it talks about the character classes that you can have in a Celtic campaign, which would be fighter, ranger, specialist, mage, druid, bard, or thief. And then it says that the druid and bard are radically changed from the player's handbook. And then you cannot be a paladin, cleric, or wizard. So very kind of common for what we've been seeing. And then it talks about, basically it doesn't really go in too much into like the character kits, like what we saw in Charlemagne's Paladins, which is something that I did really like from that book. This one kind of doesn't do that. It kind of stays away from the kits. But they're going to say that bards are actually more like priests. So they're going to move them under the priest group instead of in the rogue group. And then it tells you that rogues, are going to be the only rogue that you can play is a thief, because bards, again, have been moved over. Celtic thieves do not attract followers, this kind of thing. So, slight tweaks. And then it's going to create a new character class, Mantis or Mantace, they're seers. And so they're kind of magical using characters. And but they're going to fall again under that priest category. And so they're diviners who formed part of the Celtic priesthood along with druids and bards. That was kind of like the three-part priesthood of the Celts were, again, there was druids, bards, and then these like seers or mantes. So that's a new character class, but again, it's very little detail on what's new with it, how to play it. And then you have proficiencies and the proficiency, non-weapon proficiencies that aren't applicable to the game. There is going to be a long section here on gender in the game, and whether women characters, like what role that they would normally play in a historical game, but then how you could use them in a fantasy or legendary type game, although it doesn't break those three types of games out that way. There's a list of Celtic names, and they divide them into Gaulish, British, Irish and Welsh, which I think is really fun and interesting that they did all of those and broke them out so that you would know which culture it's from. And then they added a new thing in here called heroic feats. And it says only warriors can take them except for one of them, which is available to druids. But you take these feats by spending weapon proficiency slots. So I talked about this if you saw my video on the evolution of the fighter in TSR era D&D. I talked about how in second edition fighters had weapon proficiencies and you got so many at first level and then you get more as you go up in level, but it's kind of staggered. Well, you're instead of spending those weapon proficiency slots on weapons, you can use them on these heroic feats, and these are going to start to presage some of the things that we're again going to see in third edition with the addition of feats. If you weren't aware, feats did not exist in D&D until third edition, like officially, but we're seeing some of that kind of come out here in this particular book. So things like chariot jumps and salmon leaps and shield rims and spear catching, all that kind of stuff, which is really kind of fun. Then it's going to get into spell casting and different spells, pre-spells, spells that shouldn't be in the game, magical items that shouldn't be in the game, like we saw before. This whole section on magical islands, which I love, magical places, but specifically magical islands. And you can make a die roll, and there are things like deadly or deathless or disappearing or enchanting. These are things, again, that you can use in any game. There's really no mechanics here at all. It's just ideas. Which I really like. Magical lakes, springs, and wells, magical fortresses, all this kind of stuff, hidden magical places, stone circles. Then it's going to get into monsters and talk about existing creatures, and then things like nixies and banshees and vampires, which are the Bavinshi, which I think is really cool. Another thing they do in here is tell you how to pronounce all these names. They like phonetically spell it, which is really helpful for someone like me that doesn't know how to say a lot of these words. But they also have mermen, nixies, brownies, swan maize, nymphs, leprechauns, all that kind of stuff, which is really fun. Then it talks about the She, which again are like faith type creatures, and then how to play a character like that, and the types of characters that you would normally be. And then Fomorians, which are giants, and then Firbolg, which are also like giants. All right, and then it's going to add some new creatures in here. Fukas and water horse and Fokchan and water leapers, stuff like that. And then it's going to get into money again and treasure, honor debts, cash, available equipment, gear, weapons, the standard kind of stuff, items of treasure, imported wine, things like this. They're going to give you a whole list here of things that might be treasure. And then it's going to get into Celtic culture, and it's going to present it the same way as the Vikings book did, with this story of a character going through the year, spring, summer, winter, fall, or autumn, and historical stuff and nonfiction stuff, and then this like story to tell you what's going on. Getting to social rankings, clans and tribes, player characters, social values, Celtic women again, female adventures. It says warrior societies, fostering, fortresses and farms, food and drink, trade, law, and precept. Now, in this case, I think that this stuff is presented maybe a little bit less dry than what was presented in Vikings. Like the section on law here is like barely a paragraph. And trade is like not that long, much more like to the point, I would say. It's not as overwritten. Gods and followers, kinship goes into the gods of the Celts, temples and sacred groves, religious practices. So this is actually some helpful stuff, and it's much more detailed than what we saw in the Vikings book. And then it's going to add a gazetteer, as all the different nations. Going to get into neighboring lands like Germania, Greece, Italia, Scythia, and then imaginary lands, fairy worlds, and afterworlds, which is a big part of Celtic culture, which I really liked that. Avalon, She, Tirnan Og. And then it's going to have this section at the end of the appendix. This is called Enic, and it's his honor system. So it's a way of tracking honor. So this, I wonder if Dave Cook helped on this, because Dave Cook created the honor system that's in the Oriental Ventures book from 1985. This system is different, but the kind of concept is the same. And then there's going to be a glossary, which is super helpful. So I think that's really cool. And that's going to wrap this up. It's only 96 pages. It's a very quick book. There's the map here that you see on the back. And that is our look at Celts. Okay, and let's take a look now at HR4. This is a Mighty Fortress campaign sourcebook. Now, I'm not sure why this came out as 4th instead of 5th. HR5 is going to end up being The Glory of Rome, which was intended to pair with the Celts book. So this kind of comes in between. I thought it was kind of a weird choice. And this is one of the few that wasn't, as far as I know, wasn't intended to be paired with another book. So this was a standalone. And we see here on the cover of the gold foil, we have like a crossed pistol and like what looks like the bayonet that would be from probably from a rifle. Okay, and then on the back it says All for One and One for All, Mighty Fortress Campaign Sourcebook. And so it's going to tell us it's going to cover the years from 1550 to 1650. And now this is going to cover, unlike most of these other books that we've seen, it's just going to cover a time period, but a lot of different cultures and nations. So it says Europe was torn apart by constant warfare, social order collapsed under countless religious and civil wars. This was the age of Elizabeth, Francis Drake, Cromwell, Richelieu, D'Artagnan, and Captain Blood. So this book does have a huge job to do, which is to describe, again, not just a single culture, but multiple cultures across a century's worth of time. Okay, so now here we see on the front, again, a difference in terms of how this is presented, because the front page here is not going to have the table of contents and the credits and stuff. It's just going to have, repeat the title of the book. The table of contents is going to appear over here. Now, I think that might just be because they broke the table of contents up to much more granularity, and maybe it just wasn't going to fit. We see the credits here. This is written by Steve Winter, designed by Steve Winter. I've mentioned Steve before on the channel a few times. I had the pleasure of working with him one year when we were judging the one-page dungeon contest. I think it was the first year I did it, and Steve was one of the judges, and I interviewed him about some of his choices. But Steve was introduced to Tolkien when he was in high school. Actually, he was in Catholic school, and a nun introduced him to J.R.R. Tolkien's works. And he also was very interested in historical novels and military history. And he ends up working at a department store in college that sold war games, and he buys a war game on the Russian campaign, gets very, very interested in that. And that's going to lead him, those Russian games, or that Russian war game and wargaming in general, his military war games, and his interest in history are going to lead him into the game of Dungeons and Dragons, becoming a designer at TSR. He's hired in 1981 as an editor. And he does create like the complete psionics handbook, but his interest in history is very evident in this particular book and in his championing of the line we talked about earlier of doing these historical source books. So again, the presentation here completely different. Once again, we're going like, the Celts book, HR3, was very close to the Vikings book, HR1. This is going to be very, very different. So it's going to start out in chapter 1 with a history, and then chapter 2 is going to be patterns of daily life, and then chapter 3 is going to be characters. So it talks about how to use the book and standard introduction, and then it gets into this whole section on the history and talks about the political structure, religious upheaval, all the stuff that was happening during this time period, war, the New World, and then this timeline. And again, it's not presented as the timeline that we saw before, those bars going across the top. We're back to kind of like these bullet points. There's no actual bullets, but each year is like bolded, and it creates like a bullet point effect. Okay, so that just keeps going on. This is a lot of material for this timeline because, again, it's covering 100 years worth of time in very specific detail. It's going to give us the rulers that were around in Europe at the time for the Holy Roman Empire, the kings and queens of England and Ireland, France, Spain, rulers of Russia, and then the popes of the Roman Catholic Church. And then it's going to get into patterns of daily life. And again, a whole discussion on the sexes, home life, structure of houses, and some maps here, some diagrams, furnishings, sanitation, eating and drinking, clothing, men's fashion, women's fashion, ruffs, which were very common back then, religion, education, and then commerce and money. And then it's going to show us all the different types of coins, Spanish, Dutch, French, and English, and their names for them. Law, medicine, science, what counted as science, including alchemy, pastimes, gambling, it gets into, travel, hazards, equipment lists. Okay, so we're pretty far into the book now. And now we're going to get into our characters. Now, this one, again, is going to go back to the idea of creating character kits that are unique to the setting. This is something that I really enjoyed. I liked how they did this because it really helps you get a handle on how to play these characters. So there's going to be 4 fighter kits that you can be: gentlemen adventurers, foresters, clansmen, which are sort of like your Scottish Highlanders for the most part, and then sea dogs, obviously a seagoing adventure. Gentlemen adventurers are like the ubiquitous soldiers, and then the forester is a man of simple stock who is at home in the great forests of Europe and England. Then you have your rogue kits, and you've got 3: Vagabond, Picaro, and Courtier. And then cleric kits, there are 2: Preacher and Protector of the Faith. And then mage kits, it says mages are very rare, but if you want to play one, that you have to use this kit called the Scholarly Mage. And then it's going to go through, and so the way the kits are presented, they give you a description, and then the requirements, if there's any like ability score requirements, the role, their weapon proficiencies, non-weapon proficiencies, armor equipment, special benefits, and then special hindrances, and then wealth options. So it goes through that for all of these different kits. So some of the really fun ones, the Picaro for the rogue is the romantic rogue, a wandering scoundrel who lives by his wits. He's of low birth and generally seeks his fortune by serving a variety of masters. And so their special benefit is that basically they get, well, first off, they're poor. They have very discarded old equipment. They start out with 1 less weapon proficiency than a standard rogue, but they're limited by the weapon proficiencies that rogues are limited to. But for their special benefits, they basically steal XP from their master anytime they upstage their master in a particular setting. So, they serve the master loyally, it says. And it says the master may be good and kind, impatient, demanding, cruel, and stingy, or whatever else he chooses, as long as it's within keeping with the alignment. And then it says, in exchange for this service and the opportunity to push the Picaro around, the master can expect to lose a portion of his experience points. Every time the Picaro gets the better of his master, innocently makes his master look foolish, or outperforms his master in some significant way, as judged by the DM, the Picaro gets bonus experience points. So I think that's hilarious, but again, it could be very off-putting to some people. But if you know those like those old Bugs Bunny cartoons where Daffy Duck is like in the lead and then Porky Pig is like his trusty sideman, but Porky Pig is always ends up making Daffy Duck look foolish. Porky Pig is the Picaro character in those cartoons. Okay, those old Looney Tunes. And it says that this kit, they have to tell you, this kit is intended to be fun. The Picaro is essentially comic relief. He must play off the other characters' weaknesses, bedevil them with riddles, innocently reveal the flaws in their plans, and foil their schemes through good intentions. His most effective jibes are questions which seem perfectly reasonable, but which cannot be answered without looking foolish. So I think that's really funny. It sounds like it would be a fun character to play, although I've never played anything like that. Now, the wizard kit, the Scholarly Mage, this is very, very difficult to play. So they're able to cast spells. They have to play a specialty wizard, or they can specialize in any school except in necromancy or alteration, but they have to play a specialty wizard. They can't be a generalist mage. And then their big problem that they have is that the casting times of all spells are increased by 1 category. So rounds become turns, turns become hours, hours become days. So it says this radically alters the usefulness of some spells. So it says Featherfall could be used to float gently from the top of a cliff to the bottom, but it's not likely to help if you've already started falling. So that's really, really tough. And then it says they should never have an easy path to follow. No one's ever going to trust them. All this kind of stuff. And so it tells you, like, this is an extremely rare character to play, and it's a role-playing challenge that should be played only by experienced players. Then we're going to get into nationality and religion. There's going to be country of origins here. And then social standing is a big deal. There's another honor system as presented in here. All this artwork, by the way, is all period stuff that was done at the time. So this is one of the few that doesn't have original art in it. And then there's disgrace. There's 2 new proficiencies, begging and gunnery. Obviously, you need a gunning proficiency. And then your social standing table, and then the military life. So this is where we're going to get into all new weapons and armor. Okay, so this is where the guns are going to debut in here. Matchlock, arquebus, caliver, and musket. There's cannon. But you also have things like pikes, snaplock musket pistols, all this kind of stuff. There's piecemeal armor in here, which is a concept that was introduced actually in 1985's Oriental Adventures, but it's also in the Complete Fighter's Handbook from 1990, I believe it was. Might have been 1989. And then it's going to get into your gunpowder weapons and explain how to use them. Now, one of the fun things that's in here, well, first we'll get to the fighting school. So there's the Spanish school and the Italian school and the old style of dueling and trailing the pike. There's skirmishes and field battles. All this is about war because that's a big part of this time period. Okay, so then we're going to get into our weapon tables, and we're going to see the damage for these firearms. So an arquebus does 1d10. I'm just using the smaller, medium size. So 1d10, a caliver does 1d8, and then a musket with a rest does 1d12. Now you see there's all these little footnotes here. So that's going to tell us that for the musket, as an example, it's a 1d12 on damage. However, on a roll of 8, 10, or 12, you roll again and add to the damage. Then for the arquebus, on a roll of 8 or 10 on 1d10, you're going to roll again and add the damage. And then for the caliver, which is 1d8 damage, on an 8, you're going to roll again and add the damage. So it's sort of like the exploding damage die from Savage Worlds, but the way that they deal with it here is that weapons that deal more damage naturally have a wider range of opportunity to explode. So the musket's going to explode on 3 out of 12 options. The caliver is only going to explode on 1 out of 8 options, and then the musket or the arquebus is going to explode on 2 out of 10 options. So 20% of the time, exploding meaning you're going to do additional damage. You're going to roll an additional die called exploding. So that's how they dealt with firearms in here. From that damage standpoint. Then there's going to have a section on the 4 wars. The Netherlands revolts, talks about using war as a backdrop. French wars of religion, 30 Years' War, and then the English Civil War. Okay, and then there's a section here on the New World, which includes America, the Orient, Africa, and Southeast Asia. And then the section on folklore and fantasy, and very specifically the section on superstition. This is fantastic. I love this kind of stuff. Things like bats are associated with evil and darkness. Cats and hares are common familiars of witches and sorcerers. If a care or hat crosses your path, your trip is ill-fated. Witches draw omens from the whining of hedgehogs. Horses may die if their owners eat an odd number of eggs. All these different superstitions. I put stuff like that in my daughter's game. I think it's really, really fun. I asked the characters to tell me what's a superstition, or the players to tell me what's a superstition that your character has. So then you have your monsters and baleful creatures, fairies, elves, goblins, ghosts, restless spirits. There's sort of like Slavic vampires, but says they're different from the standard Dracula that you're used to. And other monsters that you might come into contact with, evil spirits, magic. And that says there's the magical items. And then there's some adventures in here. So there's 3 sample adventures, but they're not very detailed at all. As you can see, there's the grain mill, there's Casimir's vat, and then there's a night to remember. Okay, and then you have a bibliography, and then the maps, again, which I never removed from my book. So they're very difficult to kind of see here. And that is HR4, A Mighty Fortress. Okay, so we're zipping right along here, and we're at HR5. This is the Glory of Rome campaign source book, and we've got this gold eagle on the front that's clutching some, looks like arrows, I think. It's a very classic symbol from the Roman Empire. So moving into this one, we see that it is written by David Pulver. So David Pulver... the short version here is that he worked a lot in the role-playing game industry, but very specifically wrote a ton of stuff for GURPS, the GURPS system, generic universal role-playing system. Also worked on Traveler, though, was one of the designers on BESM, Big Eyes, Small Mouth role-playing game during the D20 era. Worked on Transhuman Space, but also wrote the complete Druid's Handbook for TSR, for second edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Okay, so again, we've talked about Mike Bolden, Thomas Reed before, and then again, our art here is by Roger Ropp, who we spoke about just a few minutes ago. So here we see the outline of the table of contents and what's going to be in this particular book. And, it is in general trying to follow this formula. It's just that they're not always in the same order or presented kind of in the same way. So as we get into our introduction, it talks about using this book, and this is even written just differently. It says, you have to make 2 decisions before starting. One is whether you have to decide whether magic and monsters exist in the game, and the other ones you have to decide whether you're going to tell what time period you're going to pick for your Roman style game, because you could do it during the Republic era, or you could do it during the Empire era, and so you have to figure that out. And it talks about how that is going to affect different things in the game, and using the second edition rules. Then it's going to have this timeline. So the timeline is presented more as that bar across the top of the pages, but it does, it's not quite as easy to read, or it doesn't have like the color bar that I kind of liked from the Vikings and the Celts book. But it just goes through all the different eras of Roman history and the Punic Wars and all that. And then it gets into the fall of the Republic, the Julio-Claudians, the Flavians, and the 5 good emperors, and then the decline of the empire and the long fall of Rome. I would highly suggest, if you're going to play a Roman game, or even just if you're someone who enjoys history and likes podcasts, the History of Rome podcast. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. It was one of my favorite podcasts ever. It covers all the different eras of Roman history, like in order. And the guy who presents it, it's just him. There's no interviews. He's just talking, has a very pleasant speaking voice. And I learned a ton about the Roman Empire, or the history of Rome, not just the empire, also the Republic era, from that podcast. And then it talks about like some suggested reading and reference books, historical novels. I like it, the comic books. He lists Asterisk the Gaul, which I thought was really fun. All right, so then it gets into the characters, and it adds a concept called birthright. So you're going to roll on this table of birthright. This is very much like the gifts table that we saw in the Vikings and the Celts book, but it also includes things like, you're born into senatorial rank or senatorial family or equestrian rank, or you're an impoverished patrician, a military family, etc. So it's very much like those gifts, okay? Because it does have things like, you're ugly, or you're handsome, or things like that, or an arranged marriage, all that kind of stuff. So it goes through that. Then it's going to tell us the character classes that are applicable in a game are the fighter, the thief, and the cleric. Okay, and then it says, and with DM approval, maybe you could play a paladin or a specialist mage, but it would be radically changed, as it tells us, and a druid, which would also be radically changed from the one that you're used to. So those are the characters. So you can't play a ranger or a mage or a psionicist, or a bard. And then for fighters, it's going to introduce fighter kits. So there's a Roman legionary kit. There's a military tribune kit. There's a Roman politician kit. They put that in fighter. I think it could have better gone in the rogue, but that's okay. A lot of politicians came out from being warriors, so I guess that makes sense. There's a gladiator kit. There's a charioteer and a street fighter. So there's a lot of kits for fighters in here. And then Paladins, it talks briefly about Paladins, but it's not really a big part of this game. Rangers, it says you can't play wizard characters if you play them. It says it should be one of the following 2 kits, the Roman Witch or the Philosopher Mage. And then as far as rogues, you can't play a bard. And if you want to play a bard, it says play a thief and then take like musical related non-weapon proficiencies. And then the rogue kit is the charlatan thief, which is kind of fun. And then the priest characters, you can be a priest of the state religion, or you could be a priest of the mysteries kit, or you can be a Mithraic priest kit, which is a Persian deity, Mithras, a Christian cleric. That's the 4th kit that you can be for a priest. And then it says, if you want to play a druid, you can't be a Roman, but you might be a Gaul. And so you should use the complete, or the Celts historical campaign source book if you want to do that. And then it modifies some of the proficiencies that we've seen before, non-weapon proficiencies, and it adds new ones like military science, politics, rhetoric, which is kind of cool. It adds, there's bonus proficiencies, and it talks about languages, it talks all about playing female characters. Then you have Roman names. And so you have a first name, you have a middle name, and then a last name, like a standard that we're used to today, and at least in Western society. Okay, and then it gets into magic and religion and talks all about like mythical wizards of other cultures, like people from Babylonia or Assyria or Persia, and like their tradition of mythical mages, foretelling the future. And then they have omens, which is again very similar to the superstitions that we saw in Mighty Fortress, but these are omens, like spotting a live woodpecker was a sign of good luck, or a broken statue of an ancestor means bad luck was coming to that person and his family. And then you have omens and auguries, and I love this kind of stuff. So again, I use things like this in the game I run for my daughter and her friends. Then it has new wizard spells, which is not something we've seen a ton of in these books, interestingly. There's only 3 or 4 of them. Protective Amulet, Seal Mouth, Love Spell, and Curse Tablet, but those are new spells that are in here. And then it has some magical items, not too many, Then it gets into religion and talks about mystery cults and the Roman gods and the imperial cult and Judeo-Christian religions. And then it gets into chapter 5, money, and talks about goods and services and miscellaneous prices and living expenses. Talks about bribes, which is a big part of Roman society. And then it gets into armor and weapons and talks about Roman armor and artillery. Rome was really big on siege weapons and artillery. And then it's going to get into the armies and enemies of Rome. It's going to talk about legionnaires and arms and armor, again, officers and organization. There's a map for a legionary fortress. Honor and dishonor, another big part of Roman life. Army life, auxiliaries, the Roman Navy, and then it talks about their enemies who they might be fighting. So Gauls, this is why the Celts book was the partner book to this Roman book. The Carthaginians, the Spaniards, and the Germans, and the Numidians, and the Britons, and rebel slaves, and Parthians, and Jewish zealots. Then you've got beasts and monsters, not too much here, couple of pages, maybe, like 5 or 6, and some new monsters, one specific. And then you have the circus. It talks all about the games. And so it talks about the circus, gaming a chariot race, dirty tricks of the circus. Then the arena, you've got gladiators, lives of gladiators, Roman characters, citizenship, patronage, social rankings, the senatorial order, the equestrian order, plebeians, foreigners, freedmen, slaves, politics, Roman government, magistrates, junior magistrates, senior magistrates, all that kind of stuff. Then it gets into city life, what life was like in Caesar's Rome. There's a map here of the city. Outside the city walls, what was it like? Imperial Rome, Roman life, what houses were like, shops, entertainment, meals, doctors and morality, justice and crime. I mean, all stuff, I guess, that you would expect from a campaign setting. It's just sometimes it's not presented in the easiest to read way to find what you need. It's going to get into inns and taverns, the provinces, Hispania, Greece and Macedonia, Gallia, Illyria, the Balkans, Egypt, Africa, Asia Minor, the Middle East, Britannia, Germania, Asia, the kingdoms of Parthia and Scythia. And then you have an ad, and you've got your fold-out maps, and you have your back cover here. It is heaven's will that my Rome shall be the capital of the world. That's the quote on this one. And that is our look at Rome. Again, I know I'm going through that very, very quickly, but I'm trying to keep us on pace so we can fit all this into less than 2 hours. And let's move on to the Age of Heroes. This is HR 6, and this is the campaign source book really for ancient Greece. So this was written by Nikki, I'm going to say Ray, it might be Ria, I assume it's Ray. And I unfortunately couldn't find a ton about Nikki. I believe she's still with us and has done a few things, but I couldn't find an in-depth biography on her. So if anybody has any more info, I would love if you would share that in the show notes below. The illustrations and icons are gonna be done by Roger Ropp. So we see here our outline. So this one is going to have character design in chapter 2 instead of in chapter 3, and then Greek life is going to come in chapter 3. So after the character. So again, this constant changing of the order in which we're going to present stuff. So then equipment and treasure, gods and heroes, and all that kind of stuff. So let's get into it and see what we have in this particular book here. So it talks about, are you going to do history versus historical role-playing and fantasy role-playing in a Greek setting? So this kind of these decisions that you have to make of what kind of game are you going to play? Is it going to be historical, or is it going to be fantasy, or some blend of the two? And then it's going to give a timeline. And again, we're going to get away from the timeline as a horizontal bar, and we're going to go back to this bullet point listing. Okay. So it goes through all this different periods of time. And this is another one that covers a long period of time, starting all the way back at 2200 BC. Okay. And going through basically all the way up through around the Golden Age in Greece, which says 500 to 338 BC. And then you've got the Persian War and the Peloponnesian War. And that talks about Sparta and Athens. There's some maps here. Then you've had the Alexandrian Empire from 338 to 323. And then it has some suggested readings. No comic books this time, but the mythology, legend, daily life, and all that kind of stuff. It breaks it out. Some fictional works and dramas. And philosophers. It talks about reading them. Okay, so now our character design, we're going to get into the character classes that are allowed, and it's going to tell you, it's going to break it up into historical or fantasy. So in a historical game, you can play a fighter or a cleric which is going to be highly changed, of course, or a bard, again, highly changed, or you can play a thief. And then in a fantasy game, you can add a ranger, but it will be very changed, and you can add a specialist wizard, very changed. And you could also add a druid that would be heavily changed in a fantasy style game. So it's going to go into the warrior classes and then give you the permitted kits that you can use. And so again, this is going to go back to the Complete Fighter's Handbook. Again, I love this. I love referencing other items. Although I guess if you didn't own those, it could be annoying. But it's going to tell you the permitted warrior kits are Amazon, Barbarian, Berserker, Myrmidon, and Peasant Hero, and Pirate Outlaw. All of those were in the Complete Fighter's Handbook. And then there's going to add a new kit, the Companion Warrior Kit. So one of the elite horse riders of the Macedonian army. And then the Hero Warrior Kit, which is the ideal warrior. And then this has a section on favors, which is one of the special benefits that they get. So you roll a d4 and your favor could be strength, luck, counsel, or gift. And then they have hindrances as well. All these kits have that. So they have fatal flaws. So you d4 flaws, and your flaw could be hubris, rage, fate, or orphan. So I like playing characters with flaws. Savage Worlds, if you've seen my video review on that, was I think the first one I ever made here on the channel, one of the first ones. They have a system of flaws that I like because they're usually role-playing challenges. You have the Hoplite Warrior Kit, which is a heavily armored foot soldier. And gets into Rangers, which, again, you're not really going to play in this type of game unless you're going full-on fantasy. The Wizard classes, it goes a little bit into restrictions on mages and spell casting and permitted wizard spells, and it gives you the list of spells here that are permitted if you're going to play a wizard in a fantasy style game. And then permitted wizard kits, and this is again coming from the Complete Wizard's Handbook. So Academician, Amazon Sorceress, Militant Wizard, Mystic, Patrician, and Peasant Wizard. And then it talks about the sources of magic. It says all wizards owe their magic to the evil goddess Hecate. So I thought that was really interesting approach to it, where magic comes from. Then the priest classes, it's going to tell you that the kits that you can play from the Complete Priest Handbook would be the Amazon Priestess, Barbarian or Berserker Priest, the Nobleman Priest, the Scholar Priest, the Healer Priest, the Oracular Priest. And then it's going to tell you prohibited priest spells that you can't use and restricted spells, and then assigning different spheres to the different gods. So chaos, law, numbers, things like that. And then the rogue classes, it's going to go through thieves and talk about them and then tell you what thief kits are appropriate from the Complete Thieves Handbook. And that's going to be acrobat, bandit, buccaneer, cutpurse, scout, spy, or swindler. And then it's going to get a little bit into bards and say, in a historical campaign, they can easily fit in like certain specific roles. So it talks about things like Helen of Troy, Achilles, Heracles, and Oedipus would all probably be unknown if it were not for the bards of ancient Greece and how the bards told those stories. So I guess it's kind of interesting. And then it says the permitted kits are the True Bard. That's one of the kits presented in the Complete Bard's Handbook. The Charlatan, the Herald, the Jongleur, the Lore Master, and the Thespian. And then it's going to get into other character details. It's going to have a very quick, short paragraph on sex that just says, although Greek society generally favors males, female characters may be used in any of the kits and classes. I think that's just the easiest way to handle it. Yes, we know historically that wasn't the case. You're playing a game, someone wants to play a female character, just let them. But that's just me. And then it gets into non-human races, secondary skills that are available, proficiencies. And these would be the non-weapon proficiencies. And it's going to give us a pretty long list here. And then it's going to describe a few new ones like art, expression, and dramatist, athletics, chicanery, oration, philosophy, rowing, tactics. So a lot of new skill or non-weapon proficiencies presented here. It's going to get into some Greek names and give us a pronunciation guide, which is helpful, and a long list of names, male and female. And then they're going to give us a map for an agora or a market place, and then a Greek house and Greek style temples. Then it's going to get into Greek life, climate, houses, furnishing, clothing, footwear, hair, all the kind of stuff that we're used to, daily life, slaves, aristocrats, customs. There's a map for a theater, banking, trade, games, Olympic games, very specifically, encounters that you might have in ancient Greece. And so this is going to tell us the kinds of monsters or animals that we might come across, sirens and the clashing rocks, and the Scylla and Charybdis. It's all kind of fun that this is all in here, right? All these myths that you've heard, probably even since you were a kid. Disallowed creatures. So it's going to go through the Monster Manual or Monstrous Compendium, it was called at the time, and tell you all the creatures that are in there that you wouldn't put in a Greek style game. and money, barter, bargaining. This is our chapter on equipment and treasure, Greek coins, equipment costs, available equipment and services. Now, this one's going to have some pictures of stuff, which is very helpful, of what things look like and give us the prices of different things, treasure and magical items, again, and that's going to tell us things that are recommended from the Dungeon Master's Guide that makes sense in a game like this rather than the ones you shouldn't use. It's going to focus on the ones that you should use. And then special magical items from Greek philosophy like Aphrodite's girdle of adoration, Apollo's arrows of disease, Ariadne's ball of thread, Athena's helmet, Athena's liquid of reincarnation, like that kind of stuff. Really fun stuff, all tied to the gods. Okay, and then it has a partial list of mythic heroes and gods and their different priesthoods and all that kind of stuff. And adapting myths for role-playing, a really cool section in here, all about the myths of Greece and how you can kind of add them to a campaign. And then it's going to go into adventures in ancient Greece and talk about some kind of campaign or some adventure ideas that you might have. So again, it's not consistent on which books have this and which doesn't, but I do think that it helps to have this kind of stuff in there. And then it's going to have this section at the end on pre-designed player characters. So this one has Artemisia of Pydna, who is a warrior with a companion warrior kit. Stavros of Aegina, who's a rogue with the buccaneer thief kit. Argus the Thessalian, I can't say that, who's a wizard with the militant wizard kit. And, just on and on. There's a bard in here. There's a warrior with the hoplite warrior kit. There's a healer with the priest kit, healer priest kit. And then it's going to get into a glossary. Again, super helpful, I think, to define all these terms if you don't know what they are. And then the Appendix 3, Tactics and Siege Engines. It's just one page and it's mostly illustrations, but it shows you standard cavalry formations that they might use, and naval tactics, how they arrange their ships, and then some drawings of some siege equipment, which is super helpful. Then our maps here at the end, the fold-out map, again, that you've seen in my books. I just haven't unfolded mine. And then on the back, Age of Heroes campaign source book, it says, future generations will marvel at us as the present age marvels at us now. And that is a quote from Pericles, the Athenian statesman. And so it just gets into what's going to be in this book. And that is our look at the Age of Heroes historical reference campaign sourcebook. Okay, and really quick, I did want to mention that there was supposed to be a companion book to the Age of Heroes when it was originally planned. When the line was being worked on and the Age of Heroes Greek historical supplement was coming out, there was going to be a companion book for adversaries of them on ancient Persia. And again, the idea of that was that because if you're playing in a historical game, the traditional adversaries that you would have in a D&D game, like all the monsters and stuff, aren't going to be in there. So you would want information to make your adversaries more, realistic and add some depth to them. So that's why these books were written in pairs, so that if you were playing in a historical campaign, you kind of had different adversaries that you could go up against, enemies, whatever you want to call it. And the decision was made for a few reasons not to publish the Persian book. One was that they just thought that there wouldn't be as much interest. It's not something that was as well known at the time as say Viking culture or Greeks or Romans. So they didn't think necessarily that people would be rushing to the store to buy a book on ancient Persian myths and characters and things like that. The other thing that kind of goes in part with that was that by the time that this book is published, 1994, TSR is not doing very well. So if you know your history of the company I've talked about here on the channel, in 3 years, they're going to be out of business and acquired by Wizards of the Coast. So that's how desperate things are getting at the time. And, as a consumer, I had no idea that was happening. But these books, these historical guides, just did not sell as well as anywhere close to what the Complete Handbook series sold. And I don't think that should have been any shock to anybody. The Complete Handbooks had a much bigger broad appeal than these historical guides did. And I think they should have, hopefully they forecasted, sales to be not as high, but for whatever reason, sales were not to the point where they wanted them. And so the line's going to be canceled. And so that's the other reason the book wasn't published. The Persian book wasn't published. Okay. So, TSR was having a lot of trouble at this time because they were publishing so many settings. And what was happening was that they were turning fans of D&D into fans of settings who would only buy things that were specific to the setting that they were playing. So if you were playing Ravenloft, you didn't buy anything that wasn't for Ravenloft. And in the past, because things were much more generic, people would pick up pretty much everything because it could be used in any game. All right. So that was kind of what was going on, but it was planned to have a paired book of Persians. All right, now let's dive into the last book in the series. This is the Crusades campaign source book. We see our gold leaf here with our 3 lions rampant. By this point, they've stopped using, this happened in the Greek book too, they've stopped using the HR designation, but this is considered to be HR 7. Written by Steve Kurtz, who did a lot of work at TSR, particularly worked on things like, wrote the Complete Necromancer's Handbook that I already talked about, but worked on Al-Qadim and Ravenloft. So Al-Qadim is going to be important for this book because Al-Qadim is, that book was written by Jeff Grubb, but Steve Kurtz is going to do a lot of work like on supplements and stuff for that game. But it was sort of like a partner book to the 1985 Oriental Adventures. So the subtitle of Al-Qadim is Arabian Adventures. And it was a book that was intended to show how to play D&D by incorporating sort of like a faux fantasy Arabian culture. Or Arabian cultures and stuff. So it's lifting myths and legends and ideas from, that part of the world and Earth history, and then adding them to a D&D game, much like Oriental Adventures did with like the Far East. Okay. So, and they're going to use a lot of that content in this book because, again, this book originally they were considering doing a paired book. So they were going to, for adversaries. So one of those paired books would have been on sort of like a Arabian work, but like historical Arabia, unlike Al-Qadim, which is, its own, it's like they created their own setting for it. What's the setting's called Al-Qadim. So much like Karatur was created as the setting for Oriental Adventures. But they were going to do a historical Arabian source book, or they were also considering doing one on the Balkans so that you could involve Mongols in this game. But again, those are going to be scrapped because the line's going to end with this book. Okay, so because of that, there are a lot of ideas in this book that incorporate not just playing like a Western Knight Crusader, but there's also options in here for playing characters of a Muslim background. And so because they didn't have that Arabian historical reference guide, they're going to pull in ideas from the Al-Qadim book, even though that was written for a faux Arabia fantasy culture, and bring them into here to use as those types of characters. Okay. So it gets into the introduction, of course, and talks about, this book is going to focus on the first 3 Crusades. And even though the Crusades involved places in Spain and in France and Central Europe, Eastern Europe, this is going to focus just on the Crusades and the Palestine and just the first 3. Okay, and so then it gets into talking about the Holy War, like through the Crusaders' eyes, the legacy of Charlemagne that led to it, the land of milk and honey you see there. And that's going to jump right into like the Saracens that they call it. And they're going to talk about like Islam, the Muslim world. And there's going to be like a map here, a very simplistic map for the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, and talk about Arab culture and the assassins. Okay, and then it's going to get into the characters. So this is going to be very... it's very detailed, but they're going to break up into, again, do you want to play a historical game, legendary game, or fantasy game? And then it's going to tell you that in a historical game, you can play a fighter, a priest, or a rogue. That's it. And then with the legendary and fantasy, you can add some characters in, but even in a fantasy game, you would never play a druid, and you could only play a psionicist or a specialist wizard if the GM approves it. So it presents the information that way. And then it's going to present a table here of what kind of characters you can play and which kits from which books that have already been published that you can play. And so it's going to have 3 columns. One's for religion, and so whether that character can be Christian or Muslim or both. And then it's going to have the subculture or sect. So Franks, Italians, Byzantines, Syrian Christians, Armenians, Sunnis, Shiites, and Turks. And then it's going to have different sources. So again, you see one of them is going to be AA, Al-Qadim, Arabian Adventures. And then the sources from the Complete Fighter's Handbook, Thieves' Handbook, Bard's Handbook, Priest's Handbook, or if it comes from this book. So you see this table here again. If you're listening now, not watching, you might want to bookmark this so you can come back and look at this table later. But it's going to show you, like, as an example, a nobleman priest kit would be Christian. They would be a subculture. They would be Frank or Frankish. And then that comes from the Complete Priest Handbook. But if you wanted to play a moralist, then your religion would be Muslim, your subculture would be Sunni, and that comes from the Arabian Adventures book. And if you want to play a warrior priest, that culture, that religion would be Christian, the subculture would be Frankish, and then the source is going to be this particular book. And then it's going to talk about that for warriors and rogues and wizards as well. So wizards has 2 kits, sorcerer and shair, and they both come from the Arabian Adventures book. even though the Shire says you could be Christian and you could be Frankish. You would be a Frankish style witch, but you're going to use the Shire kit from Arabian Adventures. Okay, so then it just goes through, talks about money and equipment, and then you have your new kits in here. So the new kits that are going to debut in this particular book is going to be the Warrior Priest for the priest character class. And then for warriors, there's the monastic warrior that is presented. That's going to be like a Templar or a Hospitaller or something like that. And then for the rogue, the new class that is added in here, the new kit, is the Pardoner. And then that's it. So there's just 3. Okay, so then it goes through the different kits. And again, so the Warrior Priest, it says, unique to the Crusades, members of this fanatical priesthood adopted a militant philosophy to defend Christianity against the perceived evil of the Saracens. So this includes characters like the Bishop Adhemar of Le Puy, the spiritual leader of the First Crusade, and Turpin, the legendary archbishop from the Song of Roland. So talks about them. And then as far as like your warrior kits in here, again, the monastic warrior is like from the military orders. So Hospitallers or Templars, Knights of St. John, that kind of thing. Okay, and then Pardoner, which is the rogue kit. It's kind of fun. It's a different idea. So the Pardoner poses as a priest or prophet to prey on the charity and faith of devout Christians at a time when miracles and holy relics were commonplace. There was no way to prove that a bit of bone actually came from any given saint. So it's just kind of, they're charlatans, essentially, just presented in the context of the time. Okay, and then you have your wizard kits, and then it talks all about the military orders and crusading warfare. Military tactics. There's a map of the Croix de Chevalier, like, the fortress castle. Political map of Outremer during the Crusades. Outremer was the name of the Holy Land that they used. And then daily life, politics, and intrigue, which is a big part of games like this. And then your timeline. So the timeline comes all the way back here at the back. And again, it's presented in the bullet point format instead of the timeline across the top, the horizontal. Okay, and then magic, monsters, and supernatural. Not too much in this particular section. Talks about miracles, priest spells, and granted powers. Wizardry, a little bit. It talks about unavailable priest spells and unavailable wizard spells so that you can kind of keep on theme. Folklore and monsters, lycanthrope, shapeshifters, and other disguises, giants, ogres, ogre magi, undead, angels, and evil spirits. Holy relics, this is our treasure section now. And then it gets into tales of the Crusaders. So again, these are just like stories of things that happen in particular times. You have a map of Jerusalem there. And the Second Crusade, like what was happening during each of these crusades. The third, and they're only going to cover the first 3. They told us that. Okay. Map of Antioch, later Crusades, there's a real quick thing, and then adventuring ideas, campaigning, accounts ransom, adventure hooks. That kind of stuff I think is very helpful, like adventuring ideas and adventure hooks and things like that is helpful for a historical game like this. You're going to have your glossary here at the back, which again, super, super helpful. And then an annotated bibliography and other sources. It talks about music, which is really fun. So, there's a record label. London offers the music of the Crusades, played with period instruments and sung in their original medieval French, German, or Latin, which is kind of fun. They added that in there. And then, of course, your map, which, once again, I never took out of my book, so it's not unfolded. Very hard to see here. And that is going to wrap up our look at the last book in the historical series, which is the Crusades. So I would say, looking through these sort of, I think the one that's probably the most useful for playing a role-playing game is probably that very first one, which is Vikings, just in the way that information is presented, even though I do think it gets a little dry and overwritten at times. But as a kid, I really loved, very specifically, I loved the Mighty Fortress. This is actually the first one that I got. My mom gave it to me because I asked for it as a gift one year. Because I wanted those rules on firearms and stuff, which, as you saw in here, it's pretty limited. There's not a lot of detail, but I was really, looking forward to that. And so I thought there was some cool stuff in there. I was slightly disappointed with the presentation because of all of these, this one is very, very historically based in terms of just giving you, just dumping all this history on you without necessarily presenting it in a way that you could use it in a game. There's a lot of really good stuff in here, like the superstitions I talked about to use in a game. but you really have to dig to kind of find it. I just don't feel like it's presented all that much to see, where you can pick and choose the things that would be fun to use in a very specific game. Most of these books tell you that they're going to give you ideas on how you can create a culture like this in a standard campaign setting like Greyhawk, Forgotten Realms, or Dragonlance. I really think that they fail at that. I don't think that it's a big part of these, even though they say that it is. And again, I think that would have been very helpful. So things like we saw the adventuring ideas and adventure hooks in the Crusades. I would have loved stuff like that in every single one of these, like standard adventure hooks to help you evoke the feeling that it's going for. But, sales for these were pretty modest. So it wasn't enough to kind of keep the line going. This is going to wrap in 1994. For context, the Blue Book series for the DM's guides are going to last until 1997. So they're going to keep going. And the complete handbook series is going to end in 1995. So both of those outlast this, and both of them start before these green historical books. So we saw that the Arabian, Mongol, Persian books, all of those were shelved. They were never published. It would be awesome to know if there was ever any kind of outline or work that was done on them and see that. If there's any, I know there's some former TSR employees that watch my channel, and if anybody knows about those and if there was any work done, I would love to hear about that. But TSR is going to pivot from this, and they were already starting to do that while this line's being done. They're seeing that, I guess they probably saw that people weren't as interested in these, so they're going to shift over to hardcore fantasy, but very different kind of fantasy. So, you've got the Ravenloft, you've got Spelljammer, both of those kind of like come out, or, right around the time the first of these, or, a little bit before. But they're going to lean into those very, very heavily. And then they're going to start doing things like Planescape, very, very different, Birthright, Dark Sun, I talked about before. Dark Sun debuts the year the first of the historical supplements debuted, 1992. So I have a whole video on Dark Sun if you want to know more about that. But those are going to be, they're all trying to play with this concept of like, can we tweak the D&D rules to evoke the setting that we're going for? And I really think that the historical guides kind of like, that's part of their legacy. But unfortunately, this is going to be the last time that we see TSR do anything with any kind of like historical based stuff, like officially. There's third-party companies that do it all the time. RuneQuest is going to do a lot of supplements that are historically based for Vikings or like Robin Hood, things like that. Probably fits maybe a little bit better with that kind of style of game. And then GURPS is really going to go hardcore into like all these historical supplements. So you find a lot of them in for that particular game as well. But this is going to be really the only time that TSR particularly does that. And, I just think it shows for a brief period of time, what D&D could have been, what it could have, a version of D&D that was a little bit more historically based, or just, a line of products that kind of stuck with this history type of theme, maybe a little bit more grounded in fantasy and being more flexible in terms of changing the rules, again, to evoke the setting and understanding that was okay to do that. And then just being open to some of these niche settings. But, that is kind of partly what killed TSR was they had too many of these niche style settings. So as you can see, like I'm a collector. You've seen my collections before as I've gone through things. I have most of the Brown Books series. I actually don't own any of the DMs series because at the time I wasn't DMing. I was a player mostly. And as you know before, also, I didn't ever really play second edition. So by the time second edition came out, my group had switched to Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. The complete handbooks really intrigued me because I had never been a DM at that point in time. So I wasn't as interested in learning how to be a better DM because I wasn't a DM at all. The historical guides I liked because I'm a history nerd, but even with me, I didn't get all of them. So as you can see, like I had never thought that I would want to play a game in ancient Greece or Rome. The Vikings and Celts book probably intrigued me a little bit more, but I had to pick and choose. And I'm more of a medieval history guy, which is why these two, Crusades and Charlemagne's Paladins, make sense. And then I told you in Mighty Fortress I got for the firearms rules. So that's just me, but I would love to hear from you guys what you thought of this series. Did you have a book that was your favorite? Do you think I was being too harsh on these books or not harsh enough or whatever it was? And, or if I missed something, I had to go through them very, very quickly. And I do apologize for that. It was just so much content to try to cover in the span of the video. But I would love to hear from you and your views on these historical books. So please leave that in the comments below. And then while you're down there, you'll find places to join me on social media. You'll find links to my blog, all the other links that I talked about before for my shops and that kind of thing, my drive-through RPG account. And you'll find all that in the show notes. And I appreciate you so much for watching. So until next time, stay safe and happy gaming. Okay, and now for a little mailbox opening before we get to the rest of the bonus content. But I got two things in the mail recently, and I wanted to share them with you. So the first one is this package here from Tower House Creative, LLC. And I do know what this is. And so, but I wanted to wait and open it with you guys here on the channel. So Tower House has sent me a few things before. You guys have, if you've been fans of the channel for a while, you may have seen their stuff show up before. But they hand make dice, and it's some really cool dice. So this particular one, well, the one that they said they were going to send is this one. It's called The Bode, Wrath, Wiles, Whisper, and Wealth. Again, this is from Tower House Creative. And these are handmade. And so it comes in this little baggie here. And so first off, let's check out the die. So it's a D4, but it's one of those other kinds. It's not the pyramidal kind or whatever. It's one with the rounded sides. So, but here, so you have treasure on 4, trick on 2, trap on 1, and tail on 3. And then it comes with this holographic sticker, which is kind of cool. And then you have some notes here. That's very cool. And then, so it says the Bode, and then this is the instructions. So I'm not going to go through all this right now, but basically these dice are made for DMs to use at the table to roll, add some random elements into the game rather than scripting everything out. So the face meanings, a trap could be a hidden physical or magical hazard with potential negative consequences. A trick is an overt challenge, puzzle mechanism, or situation requiring player ingenuity or specific character interaction skill checks. A tale is an element of narrative significance, a clue, story hook, NPC, monster, sign or encounter, or environmental storytelling detail. And then the treasure is something of tangible value or utility to the players, from mundane supplies to magic artifacts. And then it says how to use, when to roll for inspiration details during prep or play, or when players enter new areas, act unexpectedly, or investigate objects and features. And so then you roll the Bode D4, you note the result, and that reveals the core element. And then you choose your path. And says you can use the tables, use your initial Bode roll to locate the corresponding basic interpretations table below. And then you roll a D4 again on that table for specific ideas. Or path B is just to interpret directly. Use the initial result as the direct prompt, creating details fitting your chosen system and the situation. And then you apply context, ask, why is this here? And then you add clues, especially for traps and tricks, to provide hints or signs for observant players to find, ensuring fair play. So as an example, to use the tables, if the primary result was trap, then you roll a D4 again, and it could be a deadly threat, a serious threat, a moderate threat, or a minor threat. And then it gives you some kind of guidelines into like what that means. And so they have that for all of the different dice results. So I always like these things. I love random elements during games. I love random tables. You guys know that. I don't like to script out my adventures. So when my players say, oh, we're going to check out this area, maybe I didn't have it planned out, I could use a die like this to roll and figure out what's going to happen. And that way I get to be surprised too, which is really fun. So, okay. So what they did send, they sent me a Newell dice, which they'd sent before, but I think they made some new ones. So you've seen that before on the channel. And then this is the Dyadic D20, a double D10 set. So this one's new to me. And it's numbered, it says it's going to be numbered 0 to 9 twice. It's a callback to when D20s were numbered from 0 to 9 twice. And one set was colored to represent 11 to 20. And so you see, like, you have solid numbers here, and then you have the outlined numbers. So that one of those would be 10s and one would be 1s. So they make really fun stuff. I'll put links below. They have an Etsy shop where they put all this stuff out there, and it's really cool. So, And there's also a handwritten note in here. So thank you so much to the folks at Tower House Games. Also, I think it's the owner of Tower House Game, or the main creative person, just had their first baby was born to them. So cheers to them. And thank you so much for sending this. I really, really appreciate it. Okay, now the other thing was sent by one of the channel fans named John. I'm not going to reveal his last name just for his privacy. And I do think I know what this is. I'm pretty sure. But this was a really, really nice offer that they gave to me. So they watched my video on chainmail and then sent me a note indicating that they had one of the books. They had an extra of one of the books from original D&D that I don't own. It's a little hard to open. And it is this one, Swords and Spells. So this was written for original D&D, and it's kind of like going backwards to chainmail. It's a system for conducting mass scale war battles, but with the D&D rules instead of using chainmail to do that. And so this was the last of the OD&D books that I didn't have. So it's not described as a supplement for D&D, but a lot of people will call this supplement 5, supplement 4 being gods, demigods, and heroes. It's the same size, obviously. It's the same trade dress, everything else. And this was just the last one. I just didn't have this. So thank you so much to channel fan John for sending this. I really, really appreciate it. I'm so excited to add this to my collection and to read it. I've never really looked at it before other than as a PDF. So again, thank you so much. And once again, thanks to the folks over at Tower House Games for sending me the bow die and the other dice that they sent. I appreciate it. And cheers. Thanks for watching. And now for the bonus content, what I was drinking, what I was listening to when I made my notes for this particular video. And actually, truth be told, I am drinking this and listening to this album as I am editing my video right now. So I had to record this video over the space of about 3 different days. I usually try to record on Thursdays, but if you saw my community post last Thursday, at the last minute, I was able to go to Comic-Con in San Diego for the day. And so that killed that day as far as recording. And then Friday, I worked at my friend's record shop in the late afternoon to early evening. He has an event there on the last Friday of every month, and needed me to cover the shop inside while he was outside. And so then I had to record earlier in that day, and then a little bit yesterday, Saturday, and today is Sunday, the 27th. And I just got back from seeing Fantastic Four with my family, which was really, really good. Highly recommend it. And there are 2 post-credit scenes for people who want to know that kind of stuff. But I'm spinning this record right now. It's late. It's about 10:30 at night. And I needed to record this part for the video so I can try to edit it. So make it in time for the Tuesday publication of the video. So this is Jazz Dispensary Nightlights. So they put out a lot of different compilation albums. It's kind of what they're known for, but also they are known for putting finding these kind of lost or forgotten, usually kind of funky soul jazz songs or albums or things like that people have kind of, like I said, forgotten about. And I kind of like the tie-in with, like, I try to find forgotten or lost lore of D&D to share here on the channel. And I love these compilations that they put out. They also put out full albums with like entire, they'll remaster and put out an entire album from different bands. They just put out one from Cal Jader and like his kind of fusion period, which was great. We listened to it in my friend's record store the other day. But this one is, again, Nightlights. And this is a record store day release from, I can't even quite read it here. I don't know what year that was. But you can usually find these. Sometimes they're really expensive. Sometimes they're not. It just depends on the release. But this one is specifically, it says, if Saturday night is the loneliest night of the week, Moodsville is your destination. Escape the noise of the city and take in Nightlights, a new compilation from Jazz Dispensary collecting mellow, forlorn, and hauntingly beautiful tunes from Yusuf Lateef, Coleman Hawkins, Kenny Burrell, Gene Ammons, and more. And you can see the lineup here. There's Shirley Scott is on here, Eddie Lockjaw Davis, the Red Garland Trio, which I really, really like. Red Garland had, once upon a time had played with Miles Davis. And just many, many more. And I just liked it. It was the perfect mood for album that I wanted to listen to tonight while I'm editing my video for late at night. So there's the inner sleeve you can see. Also just like the artwork. And as far as the drink, this is a barrel-aged Boulevardier. I only poured a little bit here, partly because this is one of the barrel-aged drinks that my dad had in his cabinet after he passed away. He barrel-aged this himself for 2 months back in 2023, and then he bottled it. And for whatever reason, I have a few bottles of his Negroni left, barrel-aged, and Manhattan, and El Presidente he did. He had Sazeracs. But the Boulevardier is almost gone. So I just had a little bit left, and I thought I would kind of share here with you guys. It's a perfect late night after dinner drink. Again, I don't want too much because it is late at night. I don't need to drink a full glass here. So I just poured like barely, not even 2 fingers. I mean, it's just a little bit here with an orange peel. So if you're not familiar with the Boulevardier, it is essentially the same drink as a Negroni, except instead of gin, it uses bourbon or rye whiskey. My dad used bourbon. I like them with rye, but you guys know I like rye better. I like the spiciness. And Negroni and Boulevardier traditionally are 3 equal parts. So, and 1 ounce of each of gin, or, gin for Negroni, or bourbon whiskey for a Boulevardier, 1 ounce of sweet vermouth, sweet Italian red vermouth, and then 1 ounce of Campari. And now with the Boulevardier, my dad did do equal proportions. When I make them for myself, I tend to up the bourbon. So I'll do like maybe 1 1/4 or sometimes 1.5 ounces, and then keep the sweet vermouth and Campari at 1 ounce each. But that's just how I like it. So, and again, he barrel aged this, and barrel aging is something you can easily do at home. You just have to, you can just search for like cocktail barrel at home, and you get it. You have to treat it and soak it, make sure that it's ready. And then, you can just make a batch of a cocktail and then pour it in there, and then let it kind of hang out and taste it once every week or 2 weeks. Take notes until it tastes the way you want it, and then pour it out into a bottle, and there you go. So cheers. Thanks for staying through the bonus content. And I hope that you give a Boulevardier a try if you are someone who imbibes alcohol. I know some of you aren't. That's totally cool. And really what I would love is for you guys to try to find this album. So Jazz Dispensary, most of their stuff is on Spotify, so you can probably find this album, I'm sure, and stream it, or just look up some of these artists that we talked about earlier. So let me know in the comments, and cheers, and I'll talk to you next time.